Usually, when you talk about inspecting the foundation of a house, right, there's a very standard expectation of how that whole process is going to go.
Right, you hire an inspector.
Exactly. You hire the inspector. They go down into your basement with their little flashlight. They find a few, concerning cracks in the concrete.
Maybe they point out some termite damage in the joists?
Yeah, exactly. Some termite damage. And they hand you a list of recommended repairs. It's a practical, predictable process.
It's just maintenance.
Right. It's fundamentally about maintenance. You identify a structural flaw, you patch it up, and you go on living in the house. But imagine a scenario for a second where you call in two completely different inspectors.
Okay.
The first one takes a single look at the basement and tells you that the only way to truly understand the severity of the foundation issue is to let a fire burn right through your living room.
Oh, wow.
Because in their view, the nice furniture and the fresh paint, they're just like distracting you from the terminal rot underneath.
Which is, an entirely counterintuitive way to view structural integrity. You don't usually destroy the facade just to prove the framework is failing.
Right, right. But then your second inspector comes in, and this inspector ignores the cracks entirely. Instead, they look at the blueprint, they figure out who the previous contractor was that built the house, and they tell you, like, I'm not just going to remodel this kitchen. I am going to treat the previous builder like a criminal syndicate, and I'm going to use the courts to prosecute them and lock them in a concrete cell.
Yeah, so suddenly you are no longer having a conversation about home maintenance at all.
Not even close.
You're looking at a complete, radical redefinition of what it means to manage the property.
And that metaphor, honestly, perfectly encapsulates the structural, just fundamental paradigm shift we are witnessing right now when it comes to the American political system. We're completely past the era of identifying cracks and patching them.
Oh yeah, we're way past that. The conversation has shifted entirely toward either, burning the structure down to expose the rot or weaponizing the legal system to imprison the architects you disagree with.
That is exactly the massive, highly volatile political landscape we are examining today as we look toward the 2028 election. And to do this for you, the listener, we are going to walk you through two highly specific, heavily contrasting sources.
Yeah, and we should say, these aren't your standard, middle-of-the-road Sunday morning panel discussions.
No, definitely not. We are diving into two very intense ends of the spectrum that reveal a shared underlying systemic breakdown.
Right, so the first piece of source material we're looking at is a transcript from a YouTube video by a political commentator named Vaush.
Yep.
The video is bluntly titled, "Are We F per Stage Act Dollars?" And it is a raw, grassroots, highly critical perspective originating from the far left, taking direct aim at the Democratic establishment.
And to contrast that, our second source is a local AOL news article out of Mountain View, California, dated March 20th, 2026. This article outlines Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's proposed Project 2029 agenda.
Yeah, it's quite the contrast.
It really is. Now, okay, before we go any further into this deep dive, I want to be incredibly clear with you about what we are doing here today. Both of these sources contain highly charged, intense political rhetoric.
Very intense.
Yeah. The YouTube transcript features fierce, far-left critiques of both the Democratic and Republican parties, and it relies heavily on strong anti-Zionist sentiments to make its case.
And the news article, on the other hand, details aggressive political and, honestly, legal warfare between Democratic state-level leadership and the Republican Trump administration.
Exactly. So we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints, the proposed policies, or the statements contained in these sources.
Oh.
Our strictly defined job as your guides is to impartially report on the ideas presented in this material. We want to show you the ideological currents that are shaping our world right now, regardless of how extreme they might sound.
Because understanding the mechanics of these extreme positions is, frankly, the only way to understand where the political temperature actually sits right now.
Absolutely.
You have grassroots commentary arguing that American democracy is so entirely broken that an openly evil president is actually better for the country than a polite one.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, you have a sitting governor proposing a counter blueprint to criminally prosecute federal officials from the opposing party. The traditional rules of political engagement haven't just been bent, they have been completely discarded.
So let's start by looking at this YouTube commentator's perspective, because he essentially conducts a brutal process of elimination for the 2028 Democratic field.
Brutal is the right word.
I don't use it lightly. It is a complete bloodbath. If you look at the names he tosses out, he isn't just dismissing a fringe group. He is systematically wiping out the entire modern Democratic bench.
He is. And It's worth looking at the categories of politicians he dismisses because it shows the sheer scope of his rejection.
Right.
He goes after the moderate purple state figures, people like Mark Kelly in Arizona, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin.
Yep.
Then he targets the prominent swing state governors who are, usually viewed as the future of the party. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania.
Which is wild, but he doesn't stop there. He tosses out the established coastal figures like Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris.
Right.
He dismisses Cory Booker, Wes Moore, Ruben Gallego, John Ossoff, Amy Klobuchar, Seth Moulton, Pete Buttigieg, and Gina Raimondo.
Just crossing them all off the list.
All of them. He briefly mentions Tim Walz, but only to dismiss him by claiming he's leaving politics. He even brings up Rahm Emanuel, specifically describing him as looking like a demon ghoul, which is an incredibly visceral, hostile way to put a hard no on someone.
Yeah, the rhetoric is definitely designed to be abrasive, but we have to look past the insults to understand the actual mechanism of his critique here.
Right. Why is he throwing them out?
Exactly. He isn't throwing out these 17 massive political figures because he disagrees with their, healthcare proposals or their marginal tax rate plans.
No.
He is applying one central, uncompromising standard. Every single one of these dismissals hinges on the candidate's stance on Israel and Zionism.
And this brings us to a really fascinating moment in the transcript where the commentator zeroes in on Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear.
Yeah, the Politico interview.
Right, he brings up an interview Beshear gave to Politico. Beshear was asked point blank if he agreed with some of the more progressive members of his party who were labeling Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide.
And Beshear said no, he didn't agree.
Exactly. But then Beshear did something very traditional for a mainstream Democrat. He warned that the party was turning this issue into a new litmus test. Beshear explicitly rejected that, saying the party had promised to never do litmus tests again.
Which, makes perfect sense from an institutional party management perspective.
Totally.
The Democratic Party traditionally relies on a big tent philosophy, right?
Yeah.
You have varying viewpoints within the coalition, and you avoid drawing hard lines in the sand on a single issue because doing so fractures your voting base.
Yeah, a litmus test is historically dangerous for a broad coalition.
Exactly. But the YouTube commentator looks at Beshear's avoidance of a litmus test and finds it utterly absurd.
He doesn't just disagree with Beshear, he openly mocks the very idea that a political party shouldn't have a litmus test.
Right.
He uses this extreme rhetorical counterexample asking, what if a candidate was completely pro-Hamas? Would Beshear just throw his hands up and say, well, we don't do litmus tests, so come on in?
Yeah, he's using that extreme to argue that, actually, you must have lines you don't cross. He is demanding a purity test.
And we have to understand why he is demanding this specific purity test. Because for this commentator, and for the grassroots movement he represents, a politician's stance on Zionism is no longer just a box to check on a foreign policy questionnaire.
No, it's much bigger than that for them.
Right. It is a fundamental diagnostic tool for their entire political character. The source transcript argues that an affinity for Zionism has an almost perfect overlap with a politician's weakness and complicity to the capital class.
Okay, wait, pause right there. I need to push back on this, or at least ask for some clarification, because that is a massive conceptual leap.
It is a huge leap.
How does someone's foreign policy view on a conflict in the Middle East automatically equate to their domestic economic loyalty? How does supporting Israel mean you are complicit with the capital class in America?
I know it sounds disconnected at first, but that is the exact conceptual leap the commentator is making, and it's rooted in how he views political power and lobbying.
Okay, break that down for me.
He believes that the pressure to support Israel from the political establishment is so overwhelmingly strong and so financially backed by corporate and lobbying interests that it basically serves as the ultimate test of a politician's spine.
I see.
Yeah. If a politician caves to the establishment on Israel, the commentator assumes they are a malleable, corporate-aligned figure who will inevitably cave to corporate interests on domestic issues too.
So he views it as symptomatic of a deeper rot.
Exactly. If you won't stand up to the foreign policy consensus, you certainly aren't going to stand up to Wall Street or fight for the working class at home. That's his logic.
Well, that makes the visual he paints in the video makes so much more sense.
Oh, the sweating politician.
Yeah. He describes these politicians as acting like they have a gun to their backs. He says that when they talk about other subjects, they might be relaxed or dismissive, but the second the topic of Israel comes up, they sit up completely straight, sweat starts forming on their foreheads, and they repeat the exact same heavily rehearsed talking points.
It is such a vivid depiction of pure political coercion.
Yeah, he's arguing that the absolute uniformity of their responses is proof that they aren't speaking from personal conviction.
Right, because in his view, no group of diverse politicians would naturally agree so perfectly on such a complex issue.
Exactly. Therefore, the uniformity proves they are operating out of systemic fear or financial obligation to the party apparatus.
It's like the commentator is grading the entire Democratic Party on a massive final exam, but the exam only has one single pass-fail question.
Yeah, just none.
If you fail the Israel question, all your other grades are completely thrown out the window. He even admits in the transcript that Andy Bashir is generally good on trans rights in Kentucky.
But it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
Because Bashir fails the Zionist litmus test, none of his domestic policy achievements matter. He's just out.
It is a totalizing purity test that completely overrides any domestic track record.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand the mechanics of why he believes politicians are forced into this uniformity, we really have to look at the second major argument in the transcript, which focuses heavily on the financial and lobbying ecosystem.
Right, specifically AIPAC and J Street.
Yes.
Now, AIPAC being the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Normally, in mainstream political discourse, there's a pretty recognized distinction between AIPAC and J Street.
Yeah, J Street is traditionally viewed as the more liberal, progressive alternative.
Exactly. They advocate for a two-state solution. They often criticize right-wing Israeli governments, and they, position themselves as the home for pro-Israel Democrats who want peace.
For our source completely obliterates that distinction.
He rejects the premise entirely. He argues that liberal Zionism is a myth, an oxymoron. In his view, J Street is functionally identical to AIPAC.
Yeah, he claims that whether you take money from J Street or AIPAC, you are serving the exact same masters and participating in the exact same system of control.
And this is where his profound cynicism about the entire democratic process really starts to bleed through. He doesn't just think the lobbying system is flawed.
No, he thinks it's working exactly as intended.
Right. He thinks it is a perfectly designed machine built to weed out genuine human beings. He argues that to survive as a politician in this system, you essentially have to be, and I'm quoting him directly here, a shameless, money-grubbing, corrupt piece of shit.
It is a devastatingly bleak assessment of politics.
It really is.
He argues that bourgeois democracy, which is a term used to describe a capitalist democratic system where the wealthy hold the actual power, is entirely managed.
Managed, yeah.
He claims that candidates with real heart, candidates who are genuinely passionate about helping people, are far too difficult for the establishment to control. So the media and the donor class work together to systematically filter them out before they can ever gain real power.
He actually uses a specific example to back this up, pointing to the 2020 Maine Senate race.
Oh, wait.
According to the transcript, he claims the Democratic establishment actively pushed for Janet Mills over a more progressive grassroots candidate simply because they wanted a malleable, formless blob that they could control and pay to say whatever they needed.
And, regardless of the specific historical nuances of that particular Maine election, the broader point he is making is about the function of party machinery.
What do you mean?
He believes the establishment doesn't want leaders. They want employees.
Yeah.
They want politicians who will take the donor money, read the script, and maintain the status quo.
Right.
And this belief that the entire system is a managed corporate illusion leads directly to the most radical, counterintuitive argument in his entire video.
Yes. His analysis of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. And I have to admit to you, when I first read this part of the transcript, I had to read it twice because it sounds completely backwards coming from a far-left commentator.
It really does, but it is a textbook example of a political philosophy known as accelerationism.
Okay, stop right there, because I think a lot of people hear the word accelerationism thrown around on the internet. But what does it actually mean in this context? Like, how does this philosophy actually work?
So accelerationism in a political context is the belief that the current system is so deeply flawed, corrupt, or oppressive that trying to reform it through normal means, like, voting for moderate candidates or passing incremental laws, is actually harmful because it just prolongs the suffering.
Okay.
Instead, accelerationists believe you should actively push the system toward its worst, most extreme tendencies.
Wow, okay.
You want things to get so bad so quickly that the entire structure collapses, forcing a complete revolution or a total rebuild. You're accelerating the decay to get to the rebirth.
So applying that to the transcript, the commentator is absolutely clear that he despises Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
He calls Trump openly evil. He calls him obviously corrupt. He calls him onerous. There is zero affection there. But his accelerationist logic leads him to argue that in a completely broken system, Trump being president is actually better for democracy than Joe Biden.
Exactly. And the mechanism behind this logic is all about visibility.
Visibility, right.
The commentator argues that Trump's corruption is naked, it is loud, it is out in the open, and it is impossible to ignore. When Trump does something corrupt, the average person can easily look at it and identify the nature of the rot in the system. The sickness is visible right there on the surface.
But with Biden, the commentator argues the exact opposite. He claims Biden is actually atrocious for the country, specifically because of his affable presentation.
Right, because Biden represents the institutional norm. He is polite, he respects decorum, he speaks in measured political tones.
Yeah.
But to the commentator, that politeness is a dangerous anesthetic. It lulls the public back to sleep. It masks the rot. It makes people believe the system is functioning normally, while the underlying corporate and lobbying forces, that bipartisan consensus he hates, continue to quietly dismantle the country.
He gives a really specific example regarding deportations that stuck out to me. He notes that the Democratic establishment often quietly boasts that the Obama administration managed to deport more people than the Trump administration did.
Right, but they did it quieter.
Exactly, quieter and with more competency. And the commentator is saying, if the policy is still destructive, doing it politely and quietly is actually worse because nobody fights back against it.
He fundamentally believes that Democrats don't actually oppose what Republicans do on a systemic level. They only oppose the crude, unpolished way Republicans do it.
Look, I understand the logic of the argument now, but I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
The commentator is essentially arguing that a raging house fire is better than a termite infestation because at least you can see the flames and know you need to run.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But is that a functional political strategy? I mean, if you invite an openly demonic system just to wake people up and the house burns down, you still don't have a house. You are just left with ash. How does accelerating the destruction actually guarantee that something better will be built in its place?
And that right there is the eternal flaw and the massive gamble of accelerationism. It relies entirely on the assumption that whatever rises from the ashes will inherently be better than what burned down.
Which is a huge assumption.
Massive. Because history shows us that power vacuums are usually filled by those with the most force, not the most virtuous ideals. But the commentator, however, is so convinced that the termites, the hidden lobbyist-controlled rot of the establishment, have already hollowed out the entire structure, that he sees the fire as the only remaining diagnostic tool.
He is so fixated on exposing this hidden allegiance to the establishment that he proposes a fascinating thought experiment in the transcript.
The loyalty oath.
Yeah, the loyalty oath. He suggests that someone should force these politicians to sign what is effectively a loyalty oath.
It's a purely tactical maneuver designed to expose hypocrisy in his eyes. He notes that Congress frequently puts forward these virtue signal bills, resolutions designed specifically to show unwavering support for Israel.
Right.
So he flips the script. He asks, why not introduce a bill that simply states, I support America over all other nations, including Israel? He explicitly wants Israel named in the text of the bill.
And he bets that a massive number of politicians would refuse to sign it, or they would immediately decry it as anti-Semitic.
Exactly.
Why? Because in his view, they are utterly terrified of doing anything that breaks the public perception of their absolute loyalty to Israel and, by extension, the donor class. He believes this simple sentence would act as a trap, forcing them to expose where their true allegiances lie in a matter of seconds.
It's a very aggressive purity test that feeds directly into how he views the legacy of the current era. Because he believed the affable, institutional approach of the Biden administration completely failed to address this underlying rot, he predicts that history will judge this period incredibly harshly.
Yeah, he says Biden will be remembered as nothing more than a footnote, a brief and meaningless interruption in the Trump era.
Wow.
He argues that all the domestic achievements, even the billions of dollars secured in infrastructure funding, will mean absolutely nothing historically because the literal and metaphorical bridges are still falling apart. In his view, the only thing that will define the Biden legacy in the history books is the mismanagement of the Gaza situation.
It is a scorched earth assessment of the entire political landscape. He looks at the system, he looks at the Democratic bench, and he sees an apparatus so thoroughly captured by outside interests that almost no one is worth saving.
Almost no one.
Right, almost.
Because the incredible thing is that despite this brutal, uncompromising gauntlet of purity tests, there are exactly 3 names that he actually allows to survive.
Only out of every one.
Yeah. He briefly mentions AOC, and he brings up Jon Ossoff, specifically noting that Ossoff was one of only 27 senators to vote against certain arms sales to Israel, and actually gave a speech defending that vote.
Okay.
But the most significant name that survives his purge, the one who is currently wielding massive, tangible institutional power, is Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker.
And this transition from the YouTube commentator to J.B. Pritzker is where the story shifts from, like, theoretical grassroots anger to actual state-level executive warfare.
It gets real very fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because while a commentator is sitting outside the system demanding ideological purity, J.B. Pritzker is sitting inside the system, commanding the resources of a major state and actively preparing for a legal war.
Let's briefly look at exactly why Pritzker survives the YouTube commentator's test, because it connects perfectly to what Pritzker is doing now. The transcript highlights that Pritzker publicly called the situation in Gaza a genocide.
Okay.
It notes that he adopted an anti-AI pact stance, and crucially, that he was the only sitting governor to explicitly endorse a bill that would block all military aid to Israel.
So Pritzker successfully passes the grassroots foreign policy litmus test. He proves, to the commentator at least, that he isn't beholden to that specific lobbying apparatus.
Right.
But it is our second source, the AOL News article from March 2026, that reveals what Pritzker is actually doing with his domestic political power.
Mm.
And his domestic agenda is arguably just as radical as the YouTube commentator's rhetoric, except it is backed by the judicial and executive power of the state of Illinois.
The article centers on an interview Pritzker conducted with New York Times reporter Lulu Garcia-Navarro. At this point in 2026, Pritzker is running for a 3rd term as governor, but he is very clearly laying the groundwork for a 2028 White House run.
Right. He's making national moves.
Absolutely. And during this interview, he officially rolls out a massive new initiative called Project 2029.
And the branding here is highly intentional.
Oh, completely?
Project 2029 is explicitly framed as the Democratic Party's counteroffensive to the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which was the extensive conservative policy blueprint designed to overhaul the federal government during a Republican administration.
But when you actually look at the mechanics of Project 2029, it is not a traditional policy platform.
No, not at all.
It's not a binder full of ideas for renewable energy tax credits or healthcare subsidies. Pritzker states that the core mission of Project 2029 is to restore the rule of law. And the way he plans to achieve this restoration is by systematically holding people accountable who he believes have broken it.
And we are not talking about political accountability at the ballot box.
No.
When Garcia-Navarro presses him to clarify exactly what he means by accountability, Pritzker does not use standard political evasions. He explicitly states that he is pursuing the criminal and civil prosecution of Trump administration officials and federal law enforcement agents.
I want to read his exact quote from the article because the bluntness is just staggering. He says, "Criminally prosecuted, civilly prosecuted, whatever it is that we can do."
I cannot overstate how massive of an escalation this is in modern American politics.
Hold on, we need to really break down the mechanics of this because I am struggling to understand how this is even legally feasible.
It's extremely complex.
Right. Normally, when a new administration takes over, they clean house politically, they sweep the old policies under the rug, they sign a flurry of executive orders on day one to reverse the previous guy's executive orders, and they move on.
Yeah, that's the standard playbook.
They don't arrest the old cabinet. Pritzker isn't just remodeling the House. He is treating the previous administration like a criminal enterprise. How does a state governor even have the legal jurisdiction to seek criminal charges against a federal cabinet member for enacting a federal policy?
That is the crux of the constitutional friction here. It is incredibly difficult and historically unprecedented for a state to successfully prosecute a federal official for actions taken under the color of their federal office.
Okay, so there's a barrier.
A huge one. Typically, federal officials are protected by a legal doctrine known as federal immunity, which prevents states from interfering with the operations of the national government.
Right.
However, Pritzker is attempting to thread a very aggressive legal needle. He is using state-level mechanisms, specifically leaning on the newly formed Illinois Accountability Commission to investigate whether these federal officials violated state civil rights laws or state criminal statutes while executing their federal duties within the borders of Illinois.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, he is essentially arguing that federal immunity does not protect you if your policy implementation equates to criminal conduct or constitutional violations against the residents of his state.
And he isn't just making vague threats against unnamed bureaucrats either. When Fox News Digital reached out to Pritzker's office for clarification on who exactly he was targeting, his team didn't walk back his comments.
They didn't retreat at all.
No, they doubled down. They provided a press release that named specific, high-level individuals from the opposing party.
And the target list reads like the organizational chart of the Trump administration's immigration and homeland security apparatus.
Let's look at the names provided in the article. Pritzker's office specifically named White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller.
Right.
They named Tom Homan, the border czar.
Huh.
They named former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. They named Acting IC Director Tom Lyons, CBP Commissioner Rodney Scott, and Corey Lewandowski, who was serving as a special government employee for DHS.
By naming these specific individuals, Pritzker is proposing a wholesale, targeted legal assault on the leadership structure of a federal agency.
It's wild.
He is asking his state commission to comb through their public statements, their internal memos, and their policy directives to build a legal case that their high-level decisions directly led to criminal escalation and aggressive, unlawful enforcement tactics on the ground in Illinois.
But this level of legal warfare doesn't just materialize out of nowhere. I mean, a state governor doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to try and imprison the former Secretary of Homeland Security.
No, definitely not.
Something massive had to have triggered this. What specific event pushed Pritzker to deploy this extreme legal strategy against the federal government?
The flashpoint that ignited all of this was an operation conducted by the Trump administration known as Operation Midway Blitz.
Right. And according to the source material, Operation Midway Blitz was a highly aggressive, targeted immigration enforcement operation that was executed right in the heart of Chicago.
But it wasn't just a standard series of ICE raids. Those happen regularly under various administrations and, usually result in standard political grumbling from local leaders.
Right, normal friction.
The Trump administration escalated Operation Midway Blitz to an entirely unprecedented level by deploying actual National Guard troops into Chicago to assist and enforce the operation.
Which immediately triggers a massive constitutional crisis.
Huge.
You have a sitting president of the United States sending military forces, the National Guard, into a sovereign state over the explicit vocal objections of that state's sitting governor.
The friction between state and federal power here is astronomical. The Posse Comitatus Act generally restricts the federal government from using the military for domestic law enforcement.
Okay, so how do they do it?
Well, there are complex loopholes regarding the National Guard depending on their activation status. But regardless of the specific statutory loophole the federal government tried to use, Pritzker viewed it as an invasion. And in October, he struck back. He didn't just hold a press conference and issue a strongly worded letter of condemnation. He weaponized the courts. He sued the Trump administration, legally arguing that the deployment of the National Guardsmen to Chicago was unconstitutional and unlawful.
And this is where the sheer power of state institutions really comes into focus, because Pritzker actually won.
He did.
U.S. District Judge April Perry issued a temporary restraining order that legally prevented the federal government from continuing the deployment of those troops.
And the legal battle didn't stop at the district level. Naturally, the Trump administration appealed the decision, arguing that the federal executive branch has ultimate authority over immigration enforcement and national security.
Right, that's their whole argument.
But the case made its way up, and the Supreme Court actually upheld Judge Perry's temporary restraining order.
Wait, we really need to sit with that fact for a second. The Supreme Court of the United States upheld a decision that allowed a state governor to use the federal judicial system to physically block a sitting president's military deployment within his own state border.
It's staggering.
It is staggering. The Trump administration was legally forced to withdraw those federal troops in January.
It is a stunning historic victory for states' rights. But what makes it so fascinating from a political science perspective is that this states' rights victory was deployed by a progressive Democratic governor to defeat a conservative Republican federal mandate.
Oh, that's a good point.
For decades, the concept of states' rights was largely championed by conservatives pushing back against federal overreach. Pritzker has completely scrambled those historical partisan lines, proving that state-level power can be just as effectively weaponized by the left.
And the public rhetoric surrounding this constitutional showdown was absolutely toxic. This wasn't a polite disagreement over the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Pritzker was publicly accusing federal agents of waging war on our people. He openly referred to federal law enforcement as jackbooted thugs.
And President Trump fired right back with equally escalating rhetoric. He publicly claimed that Governor Pritzker and the mayor of Chicago should be in jail for failing to protect ICE officers during the operation.
So you have the President of the United States declaring that a sitting governor should be locked in a jail cell, and in response, that governor drafts Project 2029 to ensure that the president's entire cabinet actually goes to a jail cell.
It is the political equivalent of mutually assured legal destruction. And this breakdown of trust isn't just happening at the executive level. It is spilling out into civil society and clogging the lower courts, too. The AOL article details a secondary, ongoing lawsuit stemming directly from the fallout of Operation Midway Blitz.
Right. There are plaintiffs, citizens of Illinois who are actively suing federal agents, alleging that these agents violated the protesters' constitutional rights by using tear gas and excessive force during the operations in Chicago.
Yes.
And the justice system is just wildly bouncing this issue back and forth. At first, District Judge Sarah Ellis issued a preliminary injunction that barred the federal agents from using tear gas on crowds.
Right.
But then an appeals court stepped in and overturned her decision just earlier in the month of March 2026.
And the courts are oscillating so wildly because the underlying legal and constitutional questions are being stretched to their absolute breaking point.
How so?
When you reach a scenario where state and federal authorities are treating each other as hostile occupying forces, the judicial branch struggles immensely to find any stable middle ground. The law relies on a baseline assumption of cooperative federalism.
And that cooperation's gone.
It is entirely evaporated.
It makes you wonder, if a state governor is actively calling federal agents jackbooted thugs and is mobilizing his state's legal apparatus to criminally prosecute them for carrying out federal policy, does the federal system even exist anymore in any meaningful way?
That's the real question.
How does a country continue to operate when the state and federal levels are treating each other like hostile foreign nations engaged in a Cold War?
It is a profound, terrifying question for anyone to think about. Because if we synthesize what we are seeing across both of our sources today, from the YouTube transcript to the AOL News article, the deep connective tissue linking them together is a complete and total lack of faith in the traditional, unified American system.
That is exactly the through line. We have explored two completely different vantage points today. One from a guy with a webcam and a massive online following, and one from a billionaire governor sitting in an executive mansion. But they are both reacting to the exact same underlying systemic turbulence.
On one side, you have the grassroots accelerationist perspective represented by the YouTube commentator.
Right.
He looks at the democratic system, sees it as irreparably corrupted by corporate money and foreign lobbying, and decides that the only solution is absolute ideological purity.
Yeah.
He is entirely willing to burn down the entire 2028 Democratic ticket, dismissing almost every rising star in the party over a single foreign policy litmus test, because he genuinely believes an openly evil system that people can see is better than a quietly managed system that slowly suffocates them.
And on the exact opposite side, you have the pinnacle of institutional power, represented by Governor J.B. Pritzker. Pritzker manages to survive the grassroots purity test, but his response to the systemic breakdown isn't to burn the house down.
No, not at all.
Instead, he chooses to weaponize the legal system. He is actively preparing a legal war chest to criminally prosecute his federal rivals, essentially treating political opposition not as a disagreement, but as a criminal enterprise.
Both of these sources, despite operating in entirely different spheres, are operating on the exact same premise: that their opponents are not just wrong on policy, but are fundamentally illegitimate, corrupt, and a danger to the survival of the country.
So whether you are prepping for a political debate with your friends, or you are just trying to make sense of the daily news cycle without losing your mind, what you need to understand is that the 2028 election isn't going to just be about competing tax policies or healthcare rollouts.
No, those days are over.
It is going to be about fundamental systemic distrust. The battle lines are no longer just being drawn across party lines, they are being drawn within the parties themselves, and they are being drawn against the very institutions of government that are supposed to hold the country together.
And if we connect all of this to the biggest picture possible, I want you to think about the long-term implications of Pritzker's Project 2029. If the new accepted norm in American politics becomes that every incoming administration, at the state or federal level, attempts to criminally prosecute the outgoing administration's officials for how they enforce their policies, does the concept of a peaceful transfer of power even survive?
That's a chilling thought.
If losing an election doesn't just mean you go work at a think tank, but instead means you might be facing a decade in the state penitentiary, does winning an election simply become a desperate matter of staying out of prison?
Wow. That is the question, isn't it? If the structural inspection tells you that the foundation of the house is cracked and the only solutions being offered are either to set the living room on fire so you can see the rot better or to lock the previous contractor in the basement as a criminal, well, it is going to be a very, very difficult house to live in. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Your curiosity and your willingness to explore these complex, difficult currents is what makes this all worthwhile. Keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time.